Why would the world's most powerful navy close a waterway it doesn't even control? I've spent years reading satellite tasking orders and fleet movement logs for a living, and I have never seen a blockade built quite like the one that just went live in the Gulf. Stay with me, because the detail that matters most here isn't the ships. It's the single sentence buried in the Central Command statement that almost nobody is talking about yet, and I promise I'll get to it. Right now, in the northern Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman, I'm watching the kind of force posture you usually only see in a wargame briefing slide, except this one is real, and it is sitting off the Iranian coast tonight. Carrier strike groups. Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers running full Aegis combat systems. Submarines somewhere beneath the surface that I guarantee nobody on the Iranian side can currently track. Maritime patrol aircraft stacked overhead. Fast interceptor craft staged and ready for close quarters boardings. And as of this morning, Eastern Time, the order came down from the President directly to Central Command: begin enforcing a live naval blockade, stop every vessel tied to Iranian ports and coastal zones, and let everyone else pass freely. Think about that for a second, because it matters more than it sounds like it does. The Strait of Hormuz, the 15-mile channel that around 20% of the entire planet's traded oil physically has to pass through every single day, just stopped being an uncontested Iranian pressure lever. It is now an American enforcement zone. And a regime that spent 4 decades building its entire regional leverage around the threat of shutting that waterway down is waking up this morning to discover the United States Navy beat them to it, closing the strait first and closing it only to them. I want to back all the way up here, because to actually understand what this blockade represents, rather than just watching the footage scroll by, you need to understand the financial plumbing that keeps the Iranian regime alive, and why choking that plumbing with warships is a more precise weapon than anything you could drop from the air. The regime's survival has always rested on one simple financial loop, and that simplicity is both its greatest strength and its single point of failure. At the top of that loop sits oil revenue. Iran has been selling crude primarily to Chinese buyers who purchase it at a discount, specifically because doing so defies Western sanctions. And that arrangement has kept real money flowing into the regime's accounts at a pace that let it keep paying the one institution its survival actually depends on. Here's the part that took me a long time to fully appreciate when I first started tracking this conflict. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps isn't simply the army that defends the Iranian government the way most people assume. It is the organization the government has to continuously purchase the loyalty of in order to survive at all. The Guard Corps protects the regime from its own population. The clerical leadership protects the Guard Corps from financial hardship by making absolutely sure oil money keeps landing in its budget. Because a Guard Corps that isn't getting paid on time is a Guard Corps that stops suppressing protests and starts asking harder questions about who exactly it's been working for all these years. That is the loop this blockade is aimed directly at. By sealing off Iranian-linked maritime traffic at Iranian ports and coastal zones across the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, this enforcement action removes the actual revenue stream that funds that loyalty payment. Oil that can't load onto a tanker inside an Iranian port can't be sold to a Chinese refinery. Revenue that never gets generated can't be wired into the Guard Corps budget. And a Guard Corps operating under budget strain has measurably less capacity to keep paying the local commanders whose job is keeping angry crowds off the street. This is not primarily a military action, even though the tools enforcing it are entirely military. It is a financial weapon aimed at accelerating a contradiction that has been building inside Iran's power structure since this entire conflict started. The contradiction between a nuclear and proxy war ambition that eats enormous resources and a population's basic economic survival that requires those exact same resources the regime has been quietly starving from its own people for decades, to keep funding everything else. Now here's that one sentence I promised you earlier. The detail that tells you everything about how carefully this was actually built. The Central Command statement said the blockade would be enforced against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, but that forces would not impede freedom of navigation for vessels simply transiting the strait itself. Read that twice, because it's not some throwaway diplomatic courtesy line. It is the entire legal and operational architecture that separates a targeted American enforcement action against Iran, specifically from what would otherwise look like an illegal interference with international maritime law. American forces aren't closing the strait to the world. They are blockading Iranian port access specifically, while leaving the strait open for every other flag on Earth. Which is exactly why Iran's own claim that this constitutes illegal piracy has always struck me as the reflex of a government that understands precisely how narrow that legal distinction is and needs to muddy it in front of an international audience because the distinction itself completely guts Iran's legal argument. A government confident in its own position doesn't need to call maritime law enforcement piracy. It just states its case and lets lawyers argue it out. Now, here's where the geography gets genuinely interesting, and it's the part of this story I think almost nobody watching from the outside has actually connected yet. Remember all those mines the Guard Corps laid across the Strait's northern approaches over the preceding weeks, meant to make life miserable for American escort operations and force commercial shipping into slower, more dangerous routing? Those mines are now working against the exact people who planted them. They pushed commercial traffic onto southern routes, hugging the Omani coastline, further from Iranian coastal launch positions, which happens to be precisely where American naval enforcement assets can operate with the most freedom, the least exposure, and the most favorable intercept geometry against anyone trying to run this blockade on Iran's behalf. Iran built a minefield to make the Strait dangerous for American ships, and the actual effect has been to funnel commercial shipping into the one corridor where American enforcement is strongest and Iranian harassment capability is weakest. I want you to sit with that irony for a second, because strategic own goals like that don't happen often in a conflict this closely watched, and this one is going to get studied in staff colleges for years. Then there's the island position that's been functioning as what I can only describe as the Guard Corps toll booth operation, a mafia-style collection point where Iranian fast boats have been directing tankers to effectively pay for passage through what Tehran insists is exclusively its waterway. That position sits right in the exact zone where this blockade's enforcement geometry produces maximum pressure. Under this blockade, the vessels the Guard Corps was taxing and harassing simply aren't approaching those positions anymore. They're transiting the southern corridor under American naval escort instead. The toll booth is sitting there open for business, and there's nobody left driving up to pay the toll. That's not a position of strength. That's a position of watching your own leverage evaporate in real time. Iran's public response to the blockade announcement followed almost exactly the pattern I've come to expect from this regime by now: heated rhetoric about illegality, and the release of a propaganda video showing an animated aircraft carrier flipping over and missiles firing backward. I want to spend a minute on that specific piece of propaganda because I think it reveals more about the internal state of this regime than any official statement could. That video was never meant to fool American military planners. Nobody in the Pentagon forms threat assessments off animated state media clips. It was produced for one audience only: the Iranian population that has spent weeks watching this conflict grind down the Guard Corps, living through unreliable power in multiple provinces and unable to withdraw their own savings from frozen banks. The more elaborate the propaganda gets, the more it tells you about how thin the regime's actual confidence has become, because a government that genuinely believed its own strength wouldn't need manufactured footage to convince its own citizens of it. The Guard Corps naval spokesperson's public threat that no port in the Persian Gulf or Gulf of Oman would be safe carries that same inverse signal in a different register. A force that actually believes it can credibly threaten every port doesn't announce that intention days in advance. It simply executes the threat and lets the demonstrated result do the deterring. Based on everything documented about the Guard Corps' remaining fast boat flotillas and coastal launch infrastructure after weeks of sustained strikes, that capability gap between the declaration and the reality keeps widening with every strike package that finds another concealed position and removes it from the board. Now let's talk about the part of this force posture that I think is genuinely the hardest for Iran to counter, and it isn't the destroyers. It's what's underneath the water that nobody can see. American attack submarines operating in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman are essentially invisible to every sensor system Iran has left to throw at them. They don't emit the radar signature Iranian early warning systems are built to detect, and their acoustic signature, after decades of underinvestment and sanction-strangled maintenance on Iran's own passive sonar network, is far below what Iran can characterize precisely enough to generate a usable engagement solution. They are simply present beneath the surface, quietly feeding the intelligence picture, positioned for whatever tasking Central Command needs next. Any Iranian fast attack boat approaching this zone right now does so knowing American submarines are somewhere nearby, that the sensor gap between the two navies is not close, and that any escalatory move it makes is already being watched. The submarine's real contribution was never about the torpedoes it carries. It's the psychological certainty of its presence, and the knowledge that engaging American surface forces might mean engaging an adversary whose exact position can never be confirmed until the consequences have already arrived. There's an infrastructure story here too that I think deserves far more attention than it's gotten. Iran's oil pipeline project, the ambitious plan to route crude from the country's northern interior fields straight to the southern coast, bypassing Karg Island and the Strait entirely. That project is the regime's long-term structural answer to exactly the scenario that just arrived. And its existence tells you Iranian planners understood years ago that strait leverage was ultimately vulnerable to American naval dominance. The open question is whether the southern ports that pipeline connects to are themselves caught inside this blockade scope, because the Central Command statement was explicit that the blockade covers every Iranian port on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman coastline. If that pipeline's southern terminus feeds into a port on that coast, its entire strategic purpose, routing around the strait, gets defeated the moment that port falls inside the blockade scope. The pipeline that was supposed to be Iran's answer to American naval dominance may have been engineered around a scenario where the blockade covered the strait but left the ports alone. This blockade covers the ports. Before any of this went live, there was a 21-hour negotiation window that collapsed, and that collapse gives you the cleanest window into why the blockade happened at all. The vice president laid out the American position bluntly afterward, that Iran had rejected the one requirement the negotiation actually centered on: no nuclear weapons program, full stop. Iran's own counterframing, that the American side was making excessive demands, tells you everything about the actual gap between the two positions. One side believes a nuclear-armed Iran is the outcome this entire campaign exists to prevent. The other treats its nuclear program as a sovereign right, whose abandonment would be a humiliation. The regime cannot politically survive. 21 hours of talks produced no movement on that gap, and this blockade is the direct consequence. So let's walk through what actually happens in the hours right after a blockade like this goes fully live, because there's a specific cascade of decisions the Iranian command structure is being forced to make simultaneously, with degraded internal communications, under serious economic strain, in the middle of a leadership situation that has left its highest authority largely out of public view for weeks. The first decision facing them is whether to physically challenge the blockade with whatever fast attack capability still remains operational. Sending a fast boat at an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer running full Aegis integration, backed by carrier, launched fighter cover, and a submarine somewhere beneath the surface is a choice that produces one very predictable outcome, and Iran has made that exact choice before and received that exact outcome before. The open question is whether internal pressure inside the Guard Corps, hardline factions whose leadership needs to demonstrate continued capability to a domestic audience losing patience, generates enough institutional momentum to force an engagement every honest military assessment calls a losing move. Institutions under this kind of pressure sometimes make decisions their own military logic condemns, because their political logic demands them anyway. The second decision is whether to activate the Shahed drone capability from those island launch positions against vessels sitting inside the enforcement zone. The Shahed has been the Guard Corps' most persistently used weapon throughout this conflict, cheaper than ballistic missiles and launchable from scattered positions that make targeting the launch infrastructure harder than targeting a fixed surface ship. But the enforcement zone also happens to be exactly where American overhead surveillance is most concentrated, and where the close-in weapon systems on American surface combatants, built specifically to engage slow, low-flying threats at close range, are most effective against precisely the flight profile a Shahed flies. Every intercept record I've reviewed shows those defensive systems engaging these drones successfully at a consistently high rate, and the real open question is whether Iran's remaining inventory is large enough to generate the saturation volume that statistical probability requires to land even a handful of hits despite that. The third decision, and the one carrying the most cascading regional risk, is whether to strike Gulf neighbor ports directly, exactly as Guard Corps spokesmen have already threatened: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE. These are the ports those countries' own oil export revenue flows through, and facilities sitting right next to American bases staging the carrier air wings currently executing this blockade. Striking any of them would activate the exact coalition response Iran's regional proxy strategy has spent years trying to avoid triggering, giving Saudi Arabia an unambiguous justification to respond directly and pushing Gulf fighter squadrons already flying strike operations to escalate their tempo further. That threat that no Gulf port will be safe reads to me like the declaration of an organization that has modeled the coalition response, concluded it would be genuinely catastrophic for its own survival, and is issuing the threat anyway, purely because it believes the scale of that catastrophe is exactly what will deter the United States from maintaining the blockade. That's the entire deterrence theory that has governed Iranian strategic communication throughout this conflict, the idea that the threat alone can substitute for capability, and every week of operational history since this started keeps demonstrating that the theory doesn't hold up under real pressure. Now, I want to talk about the human dimension of this, because I think it's the piece that gets buried under strike counts and Aegis specifications, and it's actually the audience that matters most for how this all resolves. The Iranian population living through this right now includes families who have lost someone they loved to the regime's crackdown on domestic protests over recent months, in numbers that international monitors now place in the tens of thousands. It includes millions who can no longer access basic medicine at prices that have climbed to multiples of what they were paying only recently. It includes bank depositors who cannot pull their own savings out of their own accounts. It includes entire cities living through rolling power outages because the infrastructure investment that should have maintained their electrical grid got systematically redirected into military spending for decades instead. That population, not Washington, is the actual audience the blockade's economic consequences are designed to reach. Oil revenue that stops flowing because American destroyers are intercepting tankers never reaches the subsidy system, currently keeping the price of basic goods from collapsing entirely, and a Guard Corps whose budget comes under that kind of pressure has reduced capacity to keep paying the local enforcers whose entire job is keeping that same suffering population from organizing against the people responsible for it. The regime understands this arithmetic better than anyone watching from outside ever could, which is exactly why its propaganda videos and inflammatory spokesperson statements are aimed so explicitly at its own domestic audience rather than at any foreign government. Washington was never the audience that determines whether this regime survives. The Iranian population is. Whether Iran strikes a Gulf neighbor's port, attempts a fast boat engagement it cannot win, or instead chooses to absorb the blockade's economic weight while its diplomatic channels quietly try to construct some kind of new framework, is going to determine the entire operational tempo of whatever phase of this conflict comes next. One spark from a single fast boat. One Shahed drone that finds an unprotected corner of a port facility somewhere in Kuwait. One decision by a hardline faction that's already called any restraint an act of betrayal, trying to prove that rhetoric wasn't empty. Any single one of those events flips this from an enforcement scenario into a full combat scenario. And every carrier strike group, every Aegis destroyer, every fighter squadron, and every submarine currently positioned in that water is sitting there specifically ready for exactly that transition if it comes. There's one more architectural piece worth understanding here, because it's what actually makes this enforcement coherent rather than just individually powerful. A single warship with its own radar and its own weapons can intercept an individual threat on its own. A fully networked Aegis fleet shares one continuous real-time tactical picture across every ship simultaneously, so the moment the first destroyer detects an incoming drone, that track distributes instantly to every other ship in the formation before the drone is anywhere near engagement range of any of them. A fast boat that fires at one ship in that formation is known to every ship in that same formation within seconds of the launch being detected, which allows coordinated intercept solutions instead of each platform reacting alone. The submarine feeding passive acoustic intelligence from beneath the surface contributes to that exact same shared picture without ever needing to surface or emit anything detectable. What Iran's remaining fast boat swarm tactics were built to defeat was a single ship's individual point defense system by approaching from multiple angles at once. They were never built to defeat a fully networked system where every platform in the formation contributes to the intercept solution for every threat simultaneously. I think that's the single hardest thing for the Guard Corps to actually solve tactically, because there's no version of their existing playbook that accounts for a formation that thinks as one system rather than as a collection of separate ships. So here's where this actually stands right now. The blockade is live. The enforcement zone is established. Every carrier strike group, every Aegis destroyer, every submarine running silent beneath the surface is exactly where it needs to be for whatever comes next. Legitimate commercial traffic keeps moving freely through the strait exactly as promised. Iranian linked traffic does not move at all. A regime that spent 4 decades building its entire regional leverage around the threat of shutting this waterway down is discovering, in real time, the answer to the one question it spent those same 4 decades avoiding: what happens the moment the Navy holding the world's most powerful fleet decides not to fight its way through the strait, but simply to control who gets access to it in the first place. The strait stays open for everyone on Earth except Iran. The propaganda video of an animated aircraft carrier flipping over keeps playing on state television while, out in the water, it's supposedly mocking. Real destroyer crews hold their positions and real submarines nobody can locate hold theirs beneath them. And the blockade that was always, honestly, the logical conclusion of American naval dominance in this exact geography has just started the exact economic process that 4 decades of Iranian military investment was specifically designed to make impossible. That's the story as it stands this morning, and given how quickly this specific conflict has been moving, I would not be surprised at all if the next update on this one arrives faster than anyone currently expects.